Hello. Today I am on the map in Dayton, Ohio, near Huffman Prairie. Now Huffman Prairie is the site where the Wright brothers learned to fly their airplane. Their first flight, of course, historically was in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, but the brothers lived here in the Dayton area. Their shop was here, and so it became a hassle, really, to keep going back and forth to Kitty Hawk. And so they took a cow pasture. The farmer let them use it for free, and they had to just simply move the cows out of the way before they flew. That was the promise that they made to Farmer Huffman. But that's where they learned to control the airplane, their tests there at Huffman Prairie. And today there is a memorial up here on the hill, right there, that commemorates the Wright brothers. This field then overlooks, or this site rather, overlooks Huffman Prairie. So we're going to look down there, see if we can find it for ourselves, check out the memorial. They also have a visitor center here run by the National Park Service. We're going to check that out. So come along with me. When Wilbur Wright died in 1912, the people of Dayton felt they wanted to memorialize the Wright brothers, and that a fitting place would be at Huffman Prairie. But in 1913, the Great Flood in Dayton occurred and kind of postponed things, and probably also made them think about the fact that Huffman Prairie was prone to flooding. And so in 1940, this memorial was dedicated high above Huffman Prairie, a couple miles away. But you can see Huffman Prairie, and we'll take a look down there in a moment, from this vantage point. But this is the memorial itself, dedicated to Wilbur and Orville Wright. They have a small visitor center here that functions as not a lot of artifacts. I would hesitate to truly call it a museum, but a visitor center, interpretive center. And it talks about the Wright brothers, talks about the evolution of aviation technologies.
To the front of their flyer, causing the nose of the plane to rise or fall.
And we're already about halfway through it.
The Wright brothers' major discovery was that in order to make a turn, it is necessary.
What else would it be?
Yeah, that right down there would have been the end of it. But we'll take a look at it. This is a famous story, but I think it was sort of the thought of the people of the time. This was a quote from the managing editor of the Dayton Journal. "I sort of felt sorry for them. They seemed like well-meaning, decent enough young men, yet they were neglecting their business to waste their time day after day on that ridiculous flying machine. I had an idea it must worry their father." Shows how the Wright brothers initially went to Kitty Hawk to test glider designs. These were unmanned gliders. And they continued to perfect what they learned. They would take their learnings back to Dayton, work on their designs, and then head back down to Kitty Hawk. Eventually, in 1903, their first flight. And it was Orville who was the first man to fly an airplane. Wilbur is the man who was standing off to the side in this very iconic picture, the very first flight at Kitty Hawk. And the camera that took this picture is at Carillon Park here in Dayton, on display in the museum. The Wright brothers were businessmen, and once they had invented the plane and they perfected it, they parked it. They didn't want anybody to see them flying it. They didn't want to do any demonstrations. What they really wanted was their patent. And they protected this patent to the death. They absolutely would go after anybody legally that tried to take any of their airplane technologies, because they essentially had a patent on the airplane in general, not just a particular control system. And so it was pretty difficult to build an airplane without infringing on the patent that the Wright brothers had. It really delayed aviation in general, because there were a lot of years there that things could have been happening and they weren't happening because the Wright brothers were protecting themselves legally. And they did regret that somewhat. They regretted the fact that they really were inventors. They wanted to invent and they wanted to work on their airplane, but they felt like at the same time they needed to protect themselves financially. The Wright brothers did not like spectators around, and they were known that if there was somebody showed up with a camera or anything, they would park the plane, they would ground it until they left. Imagine a locomotive that has left its track and is climbing up in the air right toward you, a locomotive without any wheels, but with white wings instead, and you will have something like what I saw. There were not a lot of people that really got to witness it. This is saying that there were so few people who saw the airplane fly that a lot of people were considering them bluffers and liars throughout the world, that they just didn't believe the few stories that existed. Perhaps it never happened at all. This gives some perception to how old Indianapolis Motor Speedway is. The Wright exhibition team flew in their first exhibition at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in June of 1910. That's them flying around the speedway above the racetrack. This is a plane rib from the Model B. The first airplane factory was built here in the Dayton, Ohio area. Recently, it was consumed by fire. It had never really gotten the preservation that it needed, and it was just in an older area of town, and whether it was arson or some people getting in there and trying to build a fire to keep warm, I'm not sure that anybody knows, but it was largely lost just within the last couple of years. This is a sample of wood and sample of fabric that they say is most likely from the 1905 Wright 3 Flyer. You can see this piece of wood has the silver paint on it. They painted it silver to try and, it was a decoy so that people might assume that it was made of metal when in reality it was built out of wood. And a piece of fabric from the wing. So just beyond the Wright Brothers Memorial Marker, we come to this overlook. And looking out through here, we can see Wright-Patterson Air Force Base's runway. Now, what's significant about that is that just prior to the runway is Huffman Prairie, and that is where the Wright brothers learned to fly the airplane. There is a diagram here that shows, so we were seeing the end of the runway. This is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the runway. Huffman Prairie is right out here at the end of that runway, right out through there. That's where the Wright brothers really learned to fly the airplane. In 1904 to 05, they flew 40 feet above Huffman Prairie Field, solving the problems of controlling a machine in powered flight, how to turn, bank, launch, and land. They have another diagram outside here showing where Huffman Prairie is in relation to the airbase runway. And I was thinking this was kind of funny because this right here is the Air Force Museum, and you can count here there were only 2 buildings at the time, and since then they've built an additional 2. I believe that the 3rd building was built in the early 2000s, so this photo is more than 20 years old. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base used to be Wilbur Wright Field, and the Patterson came from Lieutenant Frank S. Patterson. He was a test pilot killed in a crash in 1918. That's the Patterson and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Yeah. So it looks like Patterson Field is where the primary air runway is today, and that where Wright Field was, that is down where the Air Force Museum is. So you can see the old runways there that surround the museum. And but all of this encompasses Wright-Patterson Air Force Base today. And so now we are at the famous Huffman Prairie flying field. This is where the Wright brothers flew and perfected the world's first practical airplane in 1905, the Wright Flyer 3, excuse me. And then after that, they operated a school of aviation here, training many of the world's first pilots, including military pilots. So out through here is the field itself, where the Wright brothers flew their airplane. There are a number of these markers. This post probably is supposed to have a white flag. There's a white flag down through there. It's pretty far off, so I don't think the camera will pick it up. But this is kind of the corner markers is what these are. These are corner markers to the flying field. And you can see here the shape of what they were dealing with. And we are currently at number 6, so we are right here in the field. So in Kitty Hawk, their longest flight was 59 seconds, and it was in a straight line. They knew that they had to fly longer. They knew that they needed to be able to steer this thing. And so over a course of 18 months, in 1904 and 5, the Wright brothers perfected the flying machine that they had built. Once they perfected it, they grounded it, and they sat and they waited for their patent, which came through in 1906. But up to that point, they didn't want anybody to see it flying. They didn't want to do any public demonstrations. They didn't want to give away anything that might be something that other people could copy. And this shows Huffman Prairie flying field on the map here. And this is the current Wright-Patterson Air Force Base runway, which is in fact just right over through here. And in fact, before we leave, I probably can show you some of the airplanes sitting on the tarmac over through there. In 1910, the Wright brothers opened up their flying school here. And there was a fee. There was a fee involved, always the businessman. And that was only 6 years after they themselves had learned to fly. The Wright brothers themselves gave up flying pretty early in life. Wilbur, in his case, he passed away. So he passed away in 1912. His last flight had been in 1910. And Orville, who didn't die until the late 40s, had his last hop as pilot in command in 1918. So, you know, a lot of pilots today, I would say it's kind of in their blood. They love to fly, and they keep going and going and going. And it didn't seem to be that way for him. Maybe because he was more of an inventor. But it seems odd to me, I guess, that he didn't want to fly anymore after that in the last, 30 years of his life. Based on what I've read, I think that this is typical of what it may have looked like in the field when they were flying out here. You had some tall overgrowth. It would have been somewhat of a swampy area, especially if it rained. This is a low-lying area near the river, and it would collect water. And to this day, it's never been developed, this land. It was suitable for cows and flying airplanes. Actually, I think that their point that they've made is that it really wasn't suitable. It wasn't all that suitable for flying airplanes. It's a little bit breezy here today, but at the time they dealt with generally lower wind conditions than they had in Kitty Hawk, and that was a problem for them. They had pretty unlimited space in Kitty Hawk. There was nothing around. You had plenty of room to get a running start on your takeoff, and they were somewhat more confined in this area. Now, down here ahead, I'm going to take a look at it's a replica of the hangar that they had here, as well as the catapult system that they had here when they were flying. When they were in Kitty Hawk, they had enough wind to get off the ground in think of a kite. You need some wind, and that's what they were kind of dealing with. They needed to have some speed to get it up off the ground. This thing was pretty underpowered with this little engine. And the catapult system used a weight that allowed the plane it was attached to this catapult so that it could get a little bit extra energy on the takeoff. So they have a replica of that down here. This image depicts the path that the airplane took. And so this path that I've been walking on along here, which is maybe a little bit difficult to decipher on camera, but that would be the path that the Wright brothers took. And they tried to stay within these white flagged areas. So they were kind of confined, and they didn't want to, they just were trying to be cognizant of other people's property, and they didn't want to land on other people's property, particularly because they didn't want to try to get the airplane. The airplane, what is 700 pounds, it had no wheels, and they didn't want to try to have to negotiate fences to get it back to their starting point over here on the rail system, as this mock-up over here shows. So this is a good story here. This is Milton Wright. He is the boy's father. They had agreed with him that they would never fly together, that Orville and Wilbur wouldn't fly together for fear that one crash could take out both sons. And so one day in 1910, their father came out here to this field with them, and with his blessing, apparently, they took a flight together, the boys. And then they came back down, and Orville took up his dad. And I believe, looking at this, that that's the only time that he ever flew. And as they flew, it says Milton leaned close to his son's ear and shouted above the roar of the engine's propeller and slipstream, "Higher, Orville, higher." So their sense of adventure seems to have come by honestly. This is a reproduction of the hangar that the Wright brothers used for their airplane. Don't know how they got it in and out of there. Maybe it'll say. Looks like they had to bring the airplane in sideways. So that seems like an inconvenient sort of thing. It seems like it would have been easier had they had the long side of the building open up, but maybe that wasn't structurally possible. Apparently, they had to do some disassembly. It says that they removed the forward elevator and the rear rudder before being able to store it. You can see in this image the cows out in the pastures and the airplane over here flying. Now, I'm not sure that I gathered that this is the exact location where the hangar is, or was at the time. It very well may be. And you notice this is one of the corners to the flying field, and they did want to get their work area, their hangar and their airplane where they were working on it, as far away from the property line as they could, so that they didn't have to deal with onlookers. Somebody's still flight testing out here. And the Wright brothers had days like this for sure. This is a mock-up of a system like what the Wright brothers had to launch the aircraft. The plane would start down this rail before taking off. And that was because they needed a push. They needed a boost. So this catapult system had a weight. They would bring the weight up to the top of this structure, and then when it was released, it could pull on this cable, which would help propel the airplane down the track and give it a boost for takeoff. This explains the catapult system. It says that this rail would have been as long as 240 feet. The demo model here is probably no more than 60 feet, if that. And you see they have a weight up here at the top of their catapult that would drop, and it would pull on this system, which would help give the plane some energy to get off the ground, get some speed built up. Oh, so it says that once they designed the catapult, originally they didn't have the catapult. Once they had the catapult, they were able to do it with about 60 feet of rail. And that's about what I estimated here, that this was probably about 60 feet of rail. So with the catapult, that was probably pretty accurate. It wasn't really very long. The weights were 1,600 pounds, and they were up off the ground by 16 feet. So that energy, the gravity of that pulling down, that energy was then transferred into the airplane's speed. So 120 years after the Wright brothers first learned to fly airplanes here, this area is still a hotbed of activity. So that was Huffman Prairie. In all the years that I've heard Wright brothers stories and I've heard the name Huffman Prairie, this is actually the first time I've ever been to this piece of property. So that was kind of a neat experience for me to think back 120 years ago that aviation was being born right here in this field. It's there's nothing to it. And there wasn't anything to it back then, and that was the point. It's just a field. And back then there were some cows in it, and now there's no cows. And I don't know that it's probably changed much since then, other than that. They put some signs up around here explaining what was going on here 120 years ago, explaining a little bit about the Wright brothers' story. So yeah, it was a neat experience to see, and I'm glad that I was able to bring you along. And until next time, I will see you down the road.